Hi, and thanks for joining us for this session on Mastering the Next Generation of California Science Standards. My name's Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom, but my background is as a teacher, particularly a high school math and then elementary, middle school STEM specialist. And I've been a part of KnowAtom here for about 10 years. The company is located just north of Boston, so we're East Coast in Salem, Massachusetts. And we really like the next generation science standards because they focus on higher order thinking skills. They really transition classrooms from a place of sort of a traditional model around facts to a next generation model that focus on facts but developing and using knowledge as well with skills. So really the big shift is why we teach science, specifically a shift from the kind of reason for teaching science to be knowing all about science to helping children to be able to engage in science and engineering, or at least appreciate and understand it. That requires knowledge. It's just not sufficient. So that's where putting students into the role of scientists and engineers is really the best way to engage students' critical thinking skills, to teach them the science and engineering practices dimension, and really create an inquiry environment where students are developing and using content and their own ideas as well. So curriculum materials professional development is really the final sort of chain in that. So KnowAtom, what we do is we help school districts and schools to be able to meet the needs of the next generation science standards, particularly California. We have a bunch of schools between San Diego and Mendocino County that are engaged in exactly that, next generation instruction where students are scientists and engineers in the classroom, and it's not that traditional model but a next generation model. And I'll kind of go through and show you a bit of what that's like. California is in an interesting position right now because we're basically at the point where the California science curriculum frameworks are done. They're not intended to be revised anymore. The final adoption vote, it's not really adoption, but the framework form is supposed to be finalized as of this fall, so the fall of 2016. The key piece here I think that a lot of people are wondering about is also the assessments and what that transition phase looks like. So state level assessments are intended to be piloted in 2017-18 and be operational the following year. In terms of presently, this 2015-2016 school year and 2016-2017 are really intended to be NGSS implementation phase years, really more so next year than the present year. But the expectation has been that California classrooms, really classrooms being subject to the districts and schools decision making, but really districts and schools should be implementing and transitioning to the next generation instruction and in the classroom, so that really as these next generation science assessments are rolled out and then become operational, you're in a great position to demonstrate performance. Because what you'll see, and I'll make some parallels between where the kind of next generation of science assessment is going nationally, but also the exact examples we have in places like DC and Illinois, and even some of the New England Common Assessment Program states like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and others who are very closely aligned, if not totally aligned to the next generation science standards are going. That's what you can expect really in California as well. So this is just a quick kind of timeline. One of the challenges before we jump in here too is that folks are wondering, where are the resources? Must we adopt state-adopted resources? And the answer is no, actually. And this goes back to 2011. The governor and state legislature in California suspended adoption of instructional materials until this year, and the laws changed in 2013, basically saying that, and you can see here, this is the actual literal language of the law, that if the school decides to adopt something, as long as it's in the student's best interest, involves teachers, and is reviewed appropriately, that the state adoption list is more or less obsolete. And this for some really good reasons. That whole adoption procedure really is kind of something that caters itself to a monopoly, and it's very hard for the state at a state level to vet all of the potential programs that are available and so on. So it's something to kind of keep in mind, because with the transition nationally to next generation science standards, the resources are emerging, and we're at KnowAtom, we're in a great position because we've been developing resources alongside these releases of information for the next generation science standards. And California is really unique because California, in the latest revision in May, last May, so a year ago now, they made some tweaks to the next generation science standards, not necessarily the standards themselves, but actually where the standards are assigned for mastery and grade levels. And so the California science standards offer kind of two routes. They prefer an integrated approach where you integrate all of the strands throughout the year and every year, and they give an alternative of kind of a grade-specific, content-specific, if you want to focus on earth science or something, which they kind of discourage, but a lot of people kind of operate in that model, so that's out there. When they made those changes, though, they are associating specific middle school grade span standards to specific grades, where other standards and curriculum sort of kind of leave it willy-nilly as to where you put them. So that's something we've taken into account, but something you should be aware of, because while California is next generation, it has tweaked that aspect. So one grade-specific standard is not necessarily this grade-specific in any other NGSS state. So with that in mind, the way I'd like to kind of progress through the next hour is to think first and foremost a bit about what makes the NGSS standards a little tougher than the previous standards. How do the new standards link to Common Core ELA and math? How does this change affect the methods for teaching science in California and K through 12? And also, how do the science and engineering practices integrate with the arts? And that's important because really under this switch, what you're going to see is that we're teaching children to think, and thinking is useful in all disciplines. And so the type of content and the way the next generation science standards are designed, they benefit non-STEM disciplines as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But your science time on learning has just become much more valuable to ELA, to math, but also to the arts, and we'll kind of go through that. At the foundation of the new standards is the STEM cycle. It's really the piece that teachers need to first and foremost wrap their head around, but students need to be able to understand and orient themselves. So if you were to walk into any class and say, hey, what are we doing today? And they say science because it's science class, that's great. Well, how do you know it's science? What's the difference between science and engineering? Are you engaged as a scientist or an engineer? They should be able to very quickly and easily explain that. So the basics here is that science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists ask questions, and they answer those questions by developing hypotheses and developing plans to test those hypotheses, and then carry the plans out and gather data. That's the purpose of the plan, is to produce data, gather the data, then they analyze it, and they use it to form an evidence-based conclusion. So you see, science leads to scientific knowledge, knowledge from experimentation. That knowledge helps engineers solve problems. That's the job of an engineer. An engineer solves problems using their knowledge of science. And that's why when you look at the new standards, you see engineering and the applications of science and technology, because engineering is an application of science. And it's the development of technology that engineers engage in. So that's how they solve a problem. If you want to solve headaches, you can develop a medicine for that, and that requires understanding chemistry and biology and so on, and you apply that knowledge to develop a medicine to solve the issue of headaches. And how would you test that? Well, that involves, field trials and so on, and you gather data. Does the compound actually reduce headaches? Does it have side effects? Does it have unintended consequences, and so on? So you can actually picture kind of a little mini FDA study here. Now, in the classroom, that's kind of beyond the scope, but in a classroom, we may be engineering, and I'll show you an example in a moment, water filters, or we may be engineering different types of vehicles, or so on and so forth. And I just want to clarify that engineers don't always build things that are physical. And in fact, they really aren't building things in general. What they're doing is they're designing and creating the first of something, they're testing it, and they're using that data that they get from their test to decide whether what they've designed should be refined or replicated, and they form an evidence-based conclusion off that. That's where technology comes from. The role of math here is to be able to quantify and also communicate information and analyze it as well. So that's why it's at the center. It helps scientists communicate their findings and capture results and analyze them and so on. Same thing for engineers, and it allows others to be able to replicate as well as understand, first and foremost, what is happening here. So really, really basic, but really, really important, and really, really surprisingly missing from most classrooms under the previous standards is this type of understanding. And if you're thinking, well, we did that, but we called it something else. Well, we now have something specifically to call it, and that's, I guess, the key point here. One of the pieces under the previous standards that was a little bit easier to get away with was this idea of functioning in a traditional model of instruction. And the goal of classroom instruction is to bring the 3 dimensions of the new standards as well as those performance expectations to life, not in a way that is I watch it happen, as much as I participate in actually solving a problem or answering a question, and along the way I see things come to life, and along the way I kind of have those aha moments, and I see the result of my efforts. The traditional model is very different. The traditional model is content flowing through a teacher. The teacher is the expert, the student is the pupil who listens and absorbs, and the expert demonstrates the phenomena, explains what, models facts, and the student, by being a good student, absorbs it all and is able to recall it, demonstrate it, or summarize it to show that they are proficient. That doesn't fly anymore. So you can imagine already that that traditional lecture model doesn't fly anymore. Under a next generation model, teachers really tune that inquiry environment. The relationship is not for the student as absorbing this information as much as the student developing skills and interacting directly with the content instead of the teacher who stands between the student and the content. And that content, by developing and using it with skills, the student is able to see the cross-cutting concepts come to life, which is the phenomena there. So think about the teacher. The teacher's role is vital here, by the way. You can't automate any of this. This is a very human. I mean, learning is very human, right? It's the basis of who we are at the most basic level. So what the teacher is doing is helping to gradually adjust the supports. They're helping the student understand how to engage appropriately, and they're redirecting and monitoring. So the teacher is really skillfully releasing responsibility, and as students run into hurdles, allowing the students to appropriately struggle, and holding the bar high and helping the student focus and understand that the purpose of what they're doing and the expectations for what they're doing, and really as a last resort is in some way intervening or really differentiating to help a student who flat out doesn't get something, but that's like on a one-on-one kind of or team-on-team kind of basis. So the student in this scenario really demonstrates proficiency by demonstrating the expectations themselves, which is why the next generation science standards are considered performance expectations. The students are expected to be able to develop and use content. They're also expected to use their skills to solve problems and answer questions. They're also expected to be able to identify problems and form questions as well. So that's really key. And then in terms of how students view the content, it's really, they should be able to view it in terms of like dynamic content, that it's related to other areas of content. It has a kind of system behavior. All these pieces are really key because, frankly, that shows mastery readiness in terms of a student being able to extend what they know, because that's what this is all about. It's about operating from a base where something is known but not everything. That's what scientists do, that's what engineers do, and they extend into a place that's unknown. So in the classroom, does that mean that we're developing new drugs? No. What it means, though, is that students are engaged in novel contexts and scenarios and experiences where to them things are unknown, and there's such a birth for variability that students can be working in teams, and there can be 4 or 5 or half a dozen different hypotheses and approaches in the classroom, and then you come together at a debrief and students can share their evidence-based conclusions and actually have a culture of critique that develops. So that's this next generation model, which is a real departure for a lot of California classrooms, but also really nationally. And frankly, there's entire states that really don't get it. And so thinking about the next generation science standards that you have in California, the nice thing is that California does get it, and the standards that you have really are intact. I mentioned that grade level assignment that they did in middle school, but the bottom line is that these standards are not really grade specific no matter what. They're grade specific for mastery. Really, by the end of that grade, mastery should be attained, but the curriculum's job is to get students to a mastery point. And so that's what these experiences are all about. And so a third grade curriculum should have the third grade standards for mastery, but they should also be reinforcing, K1-2 standards, as well as the introducing future standards, grade 4 or 5 even, and with the idea that students kind of see aspects of content coming together and the scenarios are changing and the vocab's building, and so you're intentionally nurturing students from one grade level to the next and also one month or unit and lesson to the next within the grade level. That's important to avoid systemic gaps, and that's a big issue for California, where you have, especially in urban scenarios where students are transient, maybe new to the country, developmentally, I mean, this is something that affects everybody. Students are not always at a point where they can take everything in and master it in a moment or even a year. And so to leave something, to think that you do something in one grade because it says it's a grade standard and leave it that way is kind of misleading, and you leave yourself at a loss by doing that. You leave systemic gaps in your system, especially as students are going to come and go and developmentally even be sick or absent. So what you see here is a performance expectation. The practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts are something you need to really be familiar with in order to master these standards, especially their implementation, because this performance expectation doesn't happen in isolation. It actually happens in a scenario, and that scenario is, there's infinite scenarios actually. But the practices are the skills that are absolutely required for students to demonstrate and use as part of developing and using the content. So blue here is practices of skills. The orange, disciplinary core ideas, are the content dimension. And then as students are engaging the content with the skills, they're viewing or able to see the phenomena playing out, and that is the cross-cutting concepts, that system model, that systems dimension. So it's really important to picture your classroom as a place where that is happening as the mode of instruction and on an everyday basis. The practices are one of the biggest shifts that some teachers think that they can take their existing curriculum and sort of insert practices, and that's going to get them there. And unless your curriculum is designed with the nature of science and engineering I described earlier, as well as that next generation inquiry environment already, that's going to be very, very difficult. And the reason is that, and we'll take a look at assessments in a second, that the STEM practices require students to be able to develop as well as use models, to ask questions and define problems, not only carry out investigations but plan them, not only interpret data but analyze it, construct explanations, argue from evidence, and so on. So curriculum that was designed or created with more of that traditional model in mind really kind of, there's not much you can do because lots of demonstrations aren't useful. You have to get rid of them. It's the students who need to be engaging in some, bringing something to life and with their own ideas, not following something that was given to them of somebody else's idea. Same thing with kind of the worksheets, and even a lot of the next generation, quote, aligned things right now that are out there they're just a textbook still with some hands-on materials and things like that. So anyhow, it's just, it's kind of an awkward place. So that's one of the reasons why you want to cast a broader net than just, whatever is previously on the adoption list or something like that, because a lot of that stuff really isn't, previous stuff isn't aligned, and then it's going to be a while before anything aligned gets on there, if it ever gets on there, because people just, they don't need it anymore. So thinking about putting the students in that role, it's, one of these kind of processes of nonfiction reading, thinking about laying that content background, then Socratic dialogue taking the place of what would have been a traditional lecture, asking questions that require students to engage their higher order thinking in order to respond. And when I say higher order thinking, I'm talking about creating, evaluating, or analyzing. What are they thinking about when they create, evaluate, analyze? And using that context. So what they're doing is they're creating concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world connections in that Socratic dialogue, and that brings you to a point where there's a problem or question that students can engage in and really break into their teams, like you see here, plan an investigation, then carry out the plan, and that's what these students are doing, and these are just second graders. The difference, so these practices and each of those three dimensions apply at all grade levels. What changes is the sort of depth and sophistication of how it manifests itself. And so at the grade 2 level, students have more structure, at least that's the way we approach it. But in the way we approach it, grade 4 students are working in blank composition notebooks, and they're really planning that entire investigation from scratch, whereas students in grade levels prior are going to be using and seeing and everything, the process and engaging all the practices. But there are parts of the process like developing a procedure from scratch, which they may not be engaging in simply because developmentally it's just not, it's not in the cards from at that point. So these students are at a point where their class has broken down into their groups, and these students are taking a problem apart. They are in the role of engineers, and they have to have a meeting of the minds, look at the materials they have available to their team, and come up with a prototype concept. They've not been shown that. They've not been shown how to solve that problem. They have to wrestle with it, create it, diagram it, develop the test, and then actually carry it out, gather some data, and then decide where they go from there, if they should refine or replicate based on the data. So that's the evidence-based conclusion. See, that environment integrates, and I don't have a scope and sequence kind of model that I'm going to show you in this webinar, but you can check out, there's some other webinars you can check out as well. There's one in particular, how to assess your curriculum for alignment with NGSS, that's on our website, which will show you kind of a scope and sequence and how that plays out. And you're welcome to do that. It's free. So check out KnowAtom.com/resources. But what it's doing, so you have intentional scope and sequence, great. Scaffolding concepts within the year, 1 year to the next, great. But what you're doing as well is not only integrating strands of NGSS, but you are helping ELA and Math Common Core, because the NGSS standards in that next generation inquiry environment are an opportunity, and I've already described a lot of these parts of it, to apply the Common Core technical subject standards for science, the engage in nonfiction reading, engage in the communication and writing standards as well. In the math context, they're using math, they're applying many standards, but at a very high level, they are a very tangible level, they are using all of the math practices. That environment requires them. That NGSS environment requires them. Calculating, graphing, mean, median, mode, difference of averages, these are all aspects of what they're going to need to apply in order to get results, form evidence-based conclusions, and so on. So there's a real interplay here between the science standards, the math standards, the ELA standards, and I'll show you a couple examples later. But even the arts, and we'll talk about that. What you should be thinking about with these new standards is the reason, and something along these lines. The reason we teach science is different now. We don't teach science so that students know all about science in terms of what scientists have discovered, which really is history. The reason we teach science is to prepare children to be able to participate in developing and using content and thinking scientifically. So that's a skill set in addition to knowledge that's really important, and it's an ability to operate within the context of the unknown. And that's something that very few classrooms have ever aimed at before the next generation science standards. So even nationally, this is a real challenge. And like I said earlier, there are some states that really just don't get it, and I won't name them, but there's a couple out there who have adopted the next generation science standards, but their whole approach isn't true to the standards the way that it is in California. And so you really have a benefit in California versus other places, because keeping the integrity of the standards means that creating, evaluating, and analyzing can happen simultaneously, and you can really use the standards the way they were intended. So the reason I show you this graphic is one of my favorite graphics. The next generation science standards place higher order thinking skills into a situation where they happen simultaneously. Creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously. And remembering, understanding, applying those lower order thinking skills, it's just not sufficient to be relying on those. And in fact, if that's what you're assessing, your whole assessment structure needs to be overhauled. And I'm going to show you how that's happening at a state level here in places like DC. DC is a really great example. And by the way, I'll just let you know at about the halfway point here, if you have any questions as we go through there on the live session, there is a spot where you can enter questions, and I'll do my best to grab questions at the end. And so that way there if I don't cover something or you have a question, a clarification or something, I'd be happy to do it. So what an NGSS aligned assessment looks like is really scenario based. Now, DC is the first in the nation to have developed and be using a NGSS assessment that's aligned at the state level, and Illinois even borrowed that as well. So it's starting to kind of look like DC is going to be the blueprint for everyone else, and they even built theirs off of some assessments like the New England Common Assessment Program, where there's strong inquiry portions. It's a computer-based assessment, so that has some conveniences and inconveniences associated with it. But it's a selected response as well as constructed response with a tech-enhanced item piece. The key thing I want to point out here, again, that fallacy of these are my grade level standards, that's what I teach. These assessments, and you can see it here, are assessing multiple grade levels of standards, even though it's a grade 5 assessment. So when you think about the California standards test, the CMA, the CAPA, whatever, those tests aren't only going to assess what's in grade 5 and grade 8, grade 10. It's actually going to be assessment of that whole grade span, and that comes back to the federal requirements as well to really be testing the grade span. So don't do yourself a disservice by teaching or trying to create curriculum where you do just the grade 5 standards in grade 5 and just the grade 6 standards in grade 6 or so on, because you have systemic gaps and you're also going to be so far from the content itself by the time you get to the testing that it's going to, it's not going to help. So when you look at some of that timeline I already mentioned earlier, that the tests are going to be operational by 18-19, but really 2017-18 is where you're going to start seeing them roll out, and even some maybe early case studies next year. It certainly talks. The DC model is based on scenarios, performance-based testing. So you basically get fictional students who are engaging in science or engineering, and so you have hypotheses, you have materials that are talked about, you have procedures that are talked about, use of scientific diagrams and data tables, and even students' conclusions. And what happens is that the student who's being assessed is asked to study the claims made by the fictional students, and this is an example, and to determine whose claim is correct and explain why, using evidence to support that claim. So this is a constructed response, that sort of claim evidence reasoning model, where your student who would be assessed in this type of a situation would be expected to be able to analyze this whole scenario, to be able to evaluate the data, and to be able to create a cogent argument about whose claim is correct, being specific and supporting it with data and really clearly reasoning it out. So that is, if your student can't do that easily as a result of instruction, then you need, or the curriculum and instruction, because the two go together, then something's not right. Because this, if you were to replace these fictional students with real students, they should have been able to kind of plan and go through this whole thing on their own, such that when they're on the other side of the table looking at fictional students or even other students in their classroom, they can create, evaluate, analyze, and using the practices of science and engineering and extending their knowledge, that content piece, to perform the expectations of the standard. Okay, so I wanted to use this as an example because it is considered aligned and multiple states have gotten on board, and I would not expect California to be very different in many ways. All those sort of multiple choice that are sort of, identify the igneous rock kind of questions are a thing of the past. Here's what multiple choices and the tech enhanced items look like. So here the tech enhanced items are, again, and themes and storylines are really huge with the new standards in the classroom, but also in assessment. So the student has to be able to look at these different organisms and place them into a food web. So they have to understand their food chains and be able to place them into a food web, and then be able to create a constructed response or an open response to explain the shortest path for energy to get from the plants to the fox. Okay, so it's kind of a two-part thing. You can drag and drop because it's computer-based assessment in this case. Again, one of the fictional students, now we're going to deal with an open multiple choice. They're going to be asked to, well, the fictional student was engaged in learning about different kinds of food chains, and so here you have this pond food chain, right? And the multiple choice question is going to ask the real student taking the assessment to look at the pond food chain and answer the question, which of the following statements best describes the movement of matter in the pond food chain? And this is my favorite part of it. Select 3 correct answers. So the idea that a student can be kind of taught to eliminate 1 or 2 answers is really not sufficient anymore, because there's now 5 and 6 possibilities in this type of model, and that's good because, frankly, it shows whether the student really understands or they don't. Or they have a partial understanding. So they have to be able to analyze, evaluate the diagram, and then clearly identify the 3 correct answers. Based on this scenario, though, you then have a constructed response. So using the model of that pond food chain, the student's expected to describe the relationship between organisms in that food chain and the exchange of matter back into the environment. So a student should be able to basically look at this and understand life cycles and think about the bacteria as being part of, a life cycle. If a minnow dies, then that matter is recycled back into the environment through another food chain, which involves the bacteria, and that matter that's made available in the environment is then able to be consumed by the algae as part of its processes, it's the nutrients it needs, and then continues through the food chain again. So again, you can picture the practices of science and engineering have to be something that's really internalized, and even the processes, scientific process and the engineering design process, need to be something students really understand so that they are able to look at something like this and be asked, answer or understand what am I being asked. In this case, they are creating an explanation that basically earlier they were forming a conclusion. So they should be able to orient themselves in that. Other examples of multiple choice and the constructed response. Scenario-based, select 3 out of 5 correct answers. Over here, scenario-based, and then there's an evaluation and creation component where which of the 3 solutions best meets the 6 criteria that the teacher, Trevor's teacher, set. Use evidence to explain your answer. So evidence-based reasoning. Again, in the context of scientific process, this is a conclusion that a student is being asked to develop. So when you think about the testing at a state level, the direction that it's going in and what you kind of, I think, can expect down the road, it really behooves you to implement and pilot or whatever you're going to do now, particularly in the fall, so that you get a running start and really can understand when you start teaching students using Socratic dialogue and releasing responsibility, having them plan their investigations, carry out their investigations, engage in that peer discourse, scientific argument from evidence. You have that practice and everything down before you can see it's absolutely required to perform highly. I mentioned earlier about the Common Core technical subject standards for ELA as well as those math practices. These are a couple I'm isolating from middle school just to show you that, and you've seen this already in the example of those assessments here, especially those constructed responses. Students have to be able to cite evidence from text to support their analysis. They have to be able to summarize their text distinct from prior knowledge. They have to be able to follow precisely multi-step procedures, but that's ELA and not that's ELA but not science, and distinguishing from facts from speculation, reasoning, judgment, and expressing information visually. Those are all examples of ELA technical subject standards that come alive in the assessment as well as the actual experience. So, think about the assessments under NGSS as being sort of almost a diary of a student's classroom experience, and your student being involved in that kind of a thing. But think about the classroom experience you create as being a student's opportunity to actually create that diary, by virtue of being engaged as the fictional students are engaged with their own ideas. Common Core math practices here, a couple pieces to point out. You can see making sense of problems, persevering and solving them, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, attending to precision, making use of structure. All these pieces are necessary to have answered any of those questions we looked at, but also they need to be necessary in the environment that you're creating in the classroom. Okay, the way that I keep talking about creating this involves one of the 5 key pivots under NGSS. So if you take a look at that webinar I mentioned earlier, how to assess your curriculum for alignment with NGSS, we talk about PEEC alignment, we go through the 5 pivots, but pulling ELA and Math Common Core into NGSS is the way the standards were designed. So if it's not happening, it's hard to believe that you're in alignment. One of the ways that this happens is to use nonfiction reading for content background, then have a Socratic dialogue where you're not validating students' ideas, but instead you're asking probing questions and causing them to think, and then you're asking other students what they think of that idea and how would they support that claim, or is there support for that claim, where, how, why. That's what a Socratic dialogue is all about, so creating those triads. And then, of course, you can transition out of that to a problem or question where the students break into their teams, plan an investigation to answer the question, or a prototype to solve the problem. And once the students have a plan, they have a purpose for materials so they can actually carry out their plan. So thinking about, again, project-based, hands-on, inquiry-based, active learning. And so carrying out science and engineering according to their plan is key, because that's how they get data to form a conclusion which they can share and debrief and compare results. So that's a model we use. That sort of thing takes place over the course of a week. Again, depends on the grade level, but it's not all happening in one class period. But you're thinking about this sort of thing happening every week. So that's where rigor comes from. Right? Rigor is not just mantra, the answer is A kind of a thing, but what it is it's engaging the practices, and so the practices are required to plan, carry out, Socratic dialogue, and so on. So having rigor means giving students that experience over and over again and transitioning through the context so that you're actually getting the content in there over the course of a year. A couple other pieces. Science and engineering are related through practices, but they're different in their application, and so they have different processes. There's a difference between practice and process. Practice is a tool. A process is a way of going from an idea or a problem to a solution, or a question to an answer. So these are the two processes we've developed over the last 10 years, which work particularly well for K-12. Very close to, within process, if you go to a STEM industry site, you're going to see different processes. They're very niche, but this is a really good sort of generic model for each that works well. And we've tested hundreds of thousands of kids. So in the context of science, you're starting with a question. Context of engineering, you're starting with a problem. There's similarity between the rest of the steps, but they're in different orders. And some of them appear in one and not the other. The key point I want to point out here is that each end in an evidence-based conclusion, each is a way of going from that concept to the solution. In the case of writing, we see this a lot. So think about ELA now. Forget about science. We teach the writing processes as tools to write, and then we teach the practices as tools to write. We teach the writing process as a way, as a way of going from an idea to a high-quality published work. So practices are things like word choice, voice, sentence structure, so on. The process is something like brainstorming, drafting, or pre-write, draft, peer review, revise, and then publish. So you need the tools, but in order to go from an idea to a high-quality published work, you need some logic. The process of science, the process of engineering, is basic logic for students to go from a question to a conclusion, or a problem to a conclusion. Okay, that's the key. So it's not saying that science or engineering is linear, that it's prescribed, or any of that. Not making that claim whatsoever. But both are logical, and both require logic and some basic structure like this in order to be replicable, in order to be verified, in order to make progress, and be repeatable. All these sort of things, really important to consider here. The way that it plays out in the classroom, things that you want to think about, is the interplay between, another key pivot here, the interplay between science and engineering. So the thing is that within a unit, and this is an example from one of our 7th grade units, is you learn about scientific concepts and students engage as scientists. So they, they get to a question, they break into their groups, they actually wrestle with that question. Here, they're going to wrestle with the question of which earth materials are most permeable to groundwater. What context is that a part of? That's a part of a background and Socratic dialogue about water cycle, percolation rates, basically aquifers, and the water cycle and groundwater depletion and replenishment. All these sort of basic scientific concepts, phase changes, matter, so on. So students engage in that, and they develop their plan, they carry out their plan, they gather their data, they form their conclusion. In the next lesson, they learn about pollution and water pollution specifically, and the idea of non-point source pollution, and how over time, depending on what they just learned about, permeability of different earth materials, pollution can make its way from the surface into groundwater and from one point in a water table to another. And so they take that knowledge and they, thinking about the context of non-point source pollution, wells, and so on, they're able to engage as engineers in a real-life context and consider the situation of needing low-cost water filtration devices. They're going to use the engineering design process now and actually work with their partner, survey the available materials, and decide on a prototype approach, diagram it, test it, gather the data, and then form an evidence-based conclusion about that prototype. Now, the thing is, they could make multiple prototypes. They may have to refine. They may have to toss the idea entirely, go back to the drawing board. See, that's where science and engineering is nonlinear. Okay? Think about this like this is one step forward, and then each time you iterate, you're making another step forward, but in a new direction. That's where science and engineering is nonlinear. So think about, this is the idea of eliminating process and saying that process and methods are, are a thing of the past is such a joke, because it's the equivalent of saying that we're not going to teach people to step forward because people don't walk in straight lines. Everywhere we walk by stepping forward, and that includes curve and linear shapes. So it's kind of the equivalent here, and that's a really important point where I think people leave themselves exposed by not really considering the importance of teaching students how to logically pursue problems and questions, or use their logic, because that's a dimension of thinking, or using your thinking. How do you assess this in the classroom? So I mentioned the state level assessments first because that's how you assess in the classroom as well. You're basically creating a miniature version of state level assessments. You want scenarios where the questions related to the scenario are going to tease out the elements of each of those foundations of the performance expectation. So again, the 3 dimensions, those are the foundations. So when you think about creating a scenario, that's going to have to engage students in that scenario. They're going to have to evaluate it, create it, and then evaluate it and analyze it, and then they're going to have to create off of their ideas about that and conclusions they've come to responses to the different questions where you're teasing out their ability to develop a model, whether they have mastered viewing a system in terms of its components as well as their interactions and their sort of system connections and so on. So that's, a key piece. One of the key pieces we focus on is making sure that those concept assessments are in there, because if you're not assessing students based on things that are not, and this is intentional, not a part of direct instruction, then you really don't know whether or not they can demonstrate their understanding. So you need 2 kinds of assessments. You need some that are related to direct instruction, vocabulary and so on, and then others which are not. And that's where you're going to really see all the pieces coming together. And that's summative informative because it informs you, well, first of all, it's summative because in the moment you know where they're at in expectations, but it's formative because by knowing where they're at, if you have a well-articulated curriculum and it's not this like 3-4 page stuff, what happens is and it's scaffolding appropriately, what you learn as a result of one of these assessments is directly applicable in your very next lesson. It's something that you can pull through to that next lesson and make a part of that conversation and really redirect the entire class or even individual students. And so That's what it means to have thoughtful, well-aligned curriculum. Effective STEM instruction, we have a new definition for this. It comes from the National Research Council, and it's a movement from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. We've already discussed on the right. Students, they've never seen a solution to the problem, so they're trying to come up with one on their own. Over here, this is the old traditional model where something's being pre-taught, it's being modeled, it's being demonstrated, or it's given on a card and students are recreating it, whatever it is. These students are absorbing in that traditional environment what's being shown, and then they're going to repeat what they've shown. So that's different. It's not their idea, it's somebody else's idea. And the new definition of effective science instruction, or STEM instruction, is this, and it's this for a reason. So effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences. So that means starting in kindergarten and following the child all the way along. It's a nurturing process. Identifying and building on what they know is part of that nurturing process between years, right, from one year to the next. Second grade should support third grade should support fourth grade in a very intentional and direct way. But it's also intentionally building from September through June. So, it shouldn't be like going into a fourth grade teacher's classroom. They should have a very clear understanding of what happened 2 grade levels before them, as well as the grade level before them. And what they are doing as a result of the curriculum should be intentionally building on that. It should also, what they're teaching in October should build on what happened in September, and that, from August and so on. That is the real special thing you can do with these new standards, and it's really necessary because what happens is it closes systemic gaps between grade levels and from one unit to the next, the way the old kind of 3-unit-a-year type model would function. And what it also does is it trains students thinking to really look for connections and to understand that that there are certain aspects which are consistent with certain aspects which are variable to being a scientist or an engineer, and so they become very comfortable with that, and so they're really better able to cope with uncertainty and try to apply their skills to navigate it. So that's key, identifying and building on what they know, providing students with the experiences to engage in the practices. Again, over here, the skills are being required, right? The practices those 8 practices I mentioned earlier, these 2 students have to use them. That's the only way they're going to get from a problem to some kind of solution, or at least some evidence about a potential solution. Because you're not grading based on whether the solution works, you're grading based on whether the student is developing the practice skills, developing the knowledge, observing being able to describe and use the content in connection with its phenomena and demonstrate the expectations. Over here, these students aren't being engaged in any of the practices. They're just trying to remember what they're being told. So that's really key. And that rigor, one unit to the next, is what's sustaining the student interest. And beyond that, there's a lot of data from different states that shows when a student can engage their own ideas, they are far more engaged. That's what they want to do. It also makes the success very personal. And it also makes students accustomed and also really get to enjoy challenges. And that's a key life skill as well. So rigor is really about being able to articulate that that arc that I showed you earlier, the kind of 5 class or however week and a half that you take to go through that nonfiction reading all the way through students forming their conclusions and presenting them, defending and arguing or whatever. That needs to happen regularly. That is what engages students in the practices and sustains their interest. So I'm not going to go through this in too much detail except to say that there's a lot of different resources out there right now. Most of them are lower level. Awareness-ready resources are the kind of common ones that help people understand. You download it off the internet. It's a 1 or 2 pager. Get it from a company, get it from a museum, the cute little book and the cute kind of binder of worksheets and, build a bridge and whatever kind of a thing. And I know what an engineer is. Knowledge readiness is kind of textbooks, all the, what scientists have discovered. Textbooks put pretty pictures and explain it. Kits, the old kind of plastic kits or the, the marbled black and white boxes, help students understand if they want to gather a particular data related to piece of data related to a question, what task to carry out. It's very task-oriented. So thinking about, if you want to find out how hard a rock or mineral is, you do a scratch test, and here's how you do it. So students know, well, if I need to find out how hard a rock or mineral is, I'll do a scratch test. Mastery readiness is what we're talking about in terms of having students with a skill set, understanding of logic, and being able to apply that in a related but unfamiliar context. Okay, fictional general contractors building a commercial kitchen needs a very durable countertop. Here's his definition of durability, and different manufacturers have given him samples of countertop with these specifications. Which kind of countertop, based on what this contractor needs, is the best suited to the environment, and use evidence to support your reasoning. That is mastery readiness, is being able to engage in that scenario and answer that question, taking the information apart, looking at the requirements, looking at the data, and forming an evidence-based conclusion. Because it's not necessarily going to be the hardest or the most expensive or anything. It really is going to be nuanced. So that's key. Mastery readiness is that type of application. So I'm just going to let you know I will take questions. I know folks need to go. Thinking about STEAM, so that art connection as we wrap up here. The art connection is really through critical thinking and that culture of critique, because artists engineer communication. There's sort of a misunderstanding that artists create things that are pretty, but the best artists actually go to jail a lot of times because they say things through their art that are unpopular with certain kinds of people, at least if you're living in a particular place where you don't have freedom of speech the way we do here. And so when you think about that, people like Pablo Picasso lived in exile for that exact reason. His work, Guernica, is one of his most famous works, really widely known. It was an engineered piece of communication. It was a statement to the world and to the fascists about the atrocities committed at Guernica. So think about that in terms of why he was living in exile, and then actually he was commissioned to do this piece for an international art exposition. He did that, sent it off, and the fascists came back to him and said, "What did you do here?" And he said, "I didn't do it, but you did." And so that's a key, piece. It's, I think, a big window into art is engineered communication. The connection with STEAM and art and the sciences and so on. It's not, the science of how paint dries, or making the things that engineers create beautiful. That's missing the boat. The connection here is that by developing those critical thinking skills and the scientific and engineering practices make students better equipped to communicate as well as receive communication, and in the case of art, better really prepared to engage in creating art as well as consuming it. And it's really important to kind of recognize that in art being not just paint but music, dance, so on, because each of those in their true form is a type of communication really targeted at a specific audience. So I'm going to grab questions here in a second. I'll just show you some quick data. So picturing, again, curriculum, professional development materials kind of fitting hand in glove, making that STEM learning environment possible. The kind of results we see, so at a place like this, I'll use some math examples here. The Massachusetts state average is 50%. This is an inner city school, 35% ELL, 72% low income, 65% free lunch, 75% high needs, nearly double the state average. They've had some shocks, but there's a positive trend. The reason for the shocks: change in administration, change in teachers. Both really matter. But when you think about the value of equipping the students with these thinking skills, it actually protects the students against massive shocks. They don't fall all the way back to where they started. They actually, they're impacted, but they recover and are able to continue on. So Key points. In less challenged environments, you see dramatic changes, but because of stable teacher sets and administrator sets, you see those gains sustained over time, and then the same thing with reduction in the needs improvement and sort of developing categories or failing categories being reduced. This is actually the highest elementary district in the state of Massachusetts. They've increased to 90% proficiency over time, and are really, I mean, it's tough to get 100%. So they're doing amazing things, but it's possible when you equip students to think. It's just hard to get every last point. In difficult circumstances, and I'll show you, this is probably one of the most difficult we've ever seen in a middle school example, going from 4% proficient to 28% over the course of 2 years, and actually functioning in line with the peer cities. There's 26 large cities in the state of Massachusetts, and this particular school added those 24 points despite being 64% ELL, or first language is not English, 95% low income, 87% free lunch, and 97% high needs, so on. We've seen similar results in New Hampshire and elsewhere. So I hope the key takeaway here is that you're not doing a disservice to your students to pilot and put them into that role, try to develop their thinking skills, use the content as a context, and frankly, empower them to be scientists and engineers in your classroom so that when they get to those assessments, even the current assessments, you know, because they are required by federal law, they're going to raise to new heights even before they become aligned. And then once they are, you've got this lead on that alignment versus your peers who have tried, you know, waited to react, basically. So there's a part 2 in the series. If you'd like to take a look, it looks much closer at lessons and that sort of thing. You can find that at KnowAtom.com/strategically, which is about strategically implementing the NGSS. There's a bunch of other resources. My name's Francis Vigent. I'll give you Mary Ellen DeLacy's contact information. And if you have any questions for me that I don't get to answer, feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to answer them. She'll get them to me, and I'll get back to you. The other piece here is take a look at what a next generation aligned, specifically one that's aligned for California, looks like. Just go on our website. All our stuff's aligned to California. You can get an example of what a month looks like from a teacher's perspective and from a student's perspective, and that should you know, give you a good sense of what your curriculum needs to look like to support teachers, because again, the teachers need to create this next generation inquiry environment in their classroom, and then on top of that, knit all the pieces together in the ways I've been describing. Case study, take a look at KnowAtom.com/results, subscribe to our blog, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, both great resources for staying in touch. All the stuff's free. In the case of if you're looking for, you know, if you're thinking about adoption cycle or something like that, and you're in a position where you're trying to put a resource in place to achieve these pieces, you know, we tend to work with district transformative focused districts focused on transformation. So if that's kind of fits what your interests are, then you know, we may be a good resource for you. Take a look. We'd be happy to talk to you. Reach out to Mary Ellen. She'll connect you to the right people, because that's really what we do. If you're just, you know, looking to kind of realign what you're up to, then hopefully what you download will kind of help. There's some rubrics and other pieces, a bunch of free webinars under resources and ebooks as well, which I hope will help in that pursuit. So in terms of questions, we have a few. I have time to answer 2. The first question has to do with the ELL and special ed students. So basically, you know, ELL students and special ed students are students like everybody else. They need to perform at a high level. In the case of ELLs, all we're talking about in dealing with ELL students is making those students are verbal first, and so in the case of anything that's written, it's making it verbal. depending again on the specifics, translation, as you would normally translate something, if that's the case, may be a factor. However, otherwise, it's making it verbal, and then the nice thing is by being verbal, hands-on, project-based, and so on, the learning comes out of the text and the need to read English, and actually students are able to acquire new words, and we see this all the time, through the basically the situation that they don't have a word in their own language to describe what they're seeing. So it becomes a tool for language acquisition. The other piece that we see, so around special ed students, so science is like anything else. Whatever's on that student's IEP is, what you are accommodating for. Now that doesn't mean removing challenge. That doesn't mean removing concepts. That doesn't mean, breaking it down necessarily. What it means is, so in the case of something like a language-based learning disability, it may mean allowing the students to engage their Kurzweil reader. If you're using the nonfiction reader on a tablet, maybe read aloud by the tablet software. That's all reasonable accommodations and whatever. Use of a scribe or voice to text, or there's like a bazillion things. So a student is not absolved from having to make plans just because they can't write it down on a piece of paper for whatever reason. They're making their plan in a different medium. And that's the benefits of technology, right? That's why we use ed tech. It's not to make something blink or to make it spin or something like this. It's to actually overcome a barrier that we can't overcome any other way. When students are below, so like let's say there's a developmental disability or students below grade level, that's a point where you can actually regress the curriculum in one sense if you're a kind of multi-age, multi-grade setting. In our case, we don't mark any of our curriculum in an obvious way with grade levels. However, another thing is that the way we approach it, we have for each unit below grade level entry points where we are really specifically explaining from the point of view of like portfolio assessments, for instance, how to break that standard down and then gather primary evidence around it as students are engaging in a particular experiment or prototyping component. So that's some of the basics, and then I have time for one more question, and this question is related to actually we can combine a couple of these. So this question is related to basically how you kind of bring all these pieces together, and basically, that's really the longer challenge. So essentially, what you need to do is one, it's just getting experience going through the process of teaching in a next generation style. But beyond that, what it's really about is upping your skill set when it comes to things like Socratic dialogue, not giving the answer, but helping students arrive at the answer, doing that through classroom dialogue, and then developing kind of a gut expectation that you can then articulate and hold students accountable to and communicate to them as there's released responsibility in the classroom and they're coming to checkpoints and things like this. So that unfortunately doesn't have a really kind of quick and easy answer. Not that any of the answers have been particularly quick. All of this is somewhat nuanced, but that's what takes time and experience, and everybody's going through it, so at least you can rest assured there. Well, thank you so much for your time, and if you have any other questions, like I said, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen, and we hope to see you again, and I wish you luck on implementing the next generation of California science standards. My name is Francis Vigent, and thank you. Have a great day.